Good. Good afternoon, everyone, if you're on the East Coast. Good morning if you're on the West Coast, and good evening if in Europe or Asia. Welcome to the June 9th, 2021 TSCA 3030. Our talk today is entitled, and you can see it on the screen, you may have noticed that when we originally advertised this program, we had a much longer title, but it isn't Christmas yet anyway, so I decided to retitle this Chickens Come Home to Roost, Biden EPA's implementation of TSCA. Now, if you know, chickens come home to roost basically means what comes around goes around, and I think the title will become much clearer as we give our presentation. Next slide, please. I'm Herbert Stryker. I give a lot of these. Next slide, please. I'm joined today by my partner, James Vota, who's given a number of these, but not recently. Recently, David Fisher, who was Deputy Assistant Administrator of the Trump EPA, has co-presented with me. So a lot of people might be asking, where's David? Well, he's actually giving a presentation at one of the conferences in town today, so he wasn't able to join us. But we're very pleased to have James. Next slide, please. Now I'm going to turn this over to James to talk about developments in the Section 5 New Chemical Review Program. James?
Yeah, thanks, Herb. Yeah, so we're talking today about some of the implementation policies of the new Biden administration with respect to TSCA and so those implications for companies. So starting out with before we talk about how those are changing new chemical review, I thought it'd be helpful to sort of briefly review where we're coming from. Next slide. So the Lautenberg Act changes sort of made three sort of important changes to the way new chemical review works, the way the statute is written. First, EPA was required to now make sort of affirmative safety determinations when reviewing a PMN, and those are divided into sort of 5 categories, which really were reflected in the prior statute. But you've got it's a more structured approach. I think importantly, it sort of changed the way the human factor here, that there's a different mindset involved when a scientist is asked to sort of sign off affirmatively that a particular use doesn't present an unreasonable risk. But they're required to do an affirmative safety determinations within sort of 5 categories. And then for each, as under the prior statute, then there's sort of a requirement for how the agency responds. We'll talk about those. But where there's an unreasonable risk, EPA is required to issue an order and pretty much a SNR, where EPA concludes that the chemical is not likely to present an unreasonable risk. It's called a C finding based on where it's located in the statute. The chemical sort of exits review at that point. And then there's the middle, where whether it presents a risk or not is less certain, a B finding. And we'll talk a little bit more about the implications of that. But so there was a structured approach now to making the safety determinations. EPA is also expressly asked to consider foreseeable uses and the risks that they present in addition to the risk promoted by the PMN submitter. Again, that was part of the prior process, but now it's sort of taking a more structured approach. And the statute changed the requirements, at least the language around the requirements for what EPA needs to do when it makes a B finding, where it provides that the chemical may present an unreasonable risk, or where there's insufficient information to determine whether the chemical may present a risk. Under the old statute, before the amendments, EPA was given the discretion to issue an order. It may issue an order to limit manufacture, processing, and use. Under the amended statute, the language has changed, so now it states that EPA shall issue an order to the extent necessary to protect against unreasonable risk. Next slide. And the question is to what extent that language really limits EPA's discretion about whether to issue orders or not, and that's a lot of the discussion has been since 2016. So under the amended statute, when there is when EPA makes a B finding, it may present an unreasonable risk for the uses described in the PMN, EPA issues an order to control that, and then follows with a SNR, and that's the way really it's always been. We see that regulated in the specified in the SNR statute. But where EPA now is finding that the uses that are not intended by, they're not described in the PMN, they're not intended by the PMN submitter, what is it that EPA is obligated to do with risk associated with those uses? Does it have to do an order and a SNR or only a SNR? Next slide. And to what extent can it rely on information provided by the submitter to control those uses? So, prior to the Lautenberg amendments, in that second case, so where EPA found risk concerns with a use not described in the PMN, it issued what was called a non-5E SNR. This is codified in the regulations, the SNR regulations at 721.170. The submitter would be allowed to proceed with the uses described in the PMN right away, and EPA would follow that with a SNR after the notice of commencement was filed. Next slide. And that balance sort of allowed, again, companies to go to market, and to the extent that there were concerns with other uses that weren't presently intended, that there was then a backstop to make sure that EPA got a chance to review those before those were practiced. After the amendment, with that change in the statute, the Obama administration took a pretty hard, sort of a very narrow kind of view about what their discretion was when EPA made a B finding. And they tend to issue orders and SNRs in any case where they found that it may present an unreasonable risk. And the way some of that, the language, the test was changed, it also made that sort of an easier finding to make. The result of that then is that companies got an order or a SNR or both in most cases, which is obviously takes time for EPA to process, but so that made individual applications take longer, but also created a very significant backlog of PMNs. There are other changes EPA had to deal with the PMNs that were in process at the time, which contributed to the backlog, but the new policies were a very significant contributor to the backlog and the delays in processing. Next slide. And with the Trump administration, they're trying to address this backlog, and I think we're looking for ways to be, I think, sort of faithful to the words of the statute, but also to be able to move things along a little faster. And in a series of steps, they moved to a process where EPA, during the review process, when they saw what that might be a B finding, they may have a foreseeable use with not the PMN submitters use, but another use that might present an unreasonable risk. During the review period itself, the agency would issue a SNR, or at least propose a SNR, that would sort of control that foreseeable risk. And then in reliance on that, having that use controlled, it could make a finding of not likely to present an unreasonable risk. So it didn't change that the fact that most chemicals were coming through the process with some kind of a SNR, but it did reduce the number of orders and speeded up the process. It just essentially sort of reordered the old non-5E SNR process, so the SNR was done up front rather than after the NOC was filed. So it improved the backlog and reduced delay, but it still remained, and that's where we were at the time the Biden administration came in. Next slide, please. The new Deputy Assistant Administrator, Michal Friedhoff, has announced in a couple of speeches this spring, really some new direction or a return to the old direction for the new chemical review process. She's made it clear that EPA will no longer rely on using SNRs proposed or issued during the PMN review process to avoid these B findings. And the result of that is going to be now that we're going to find, there'll be more B findings. And she's also said that, in those cases, she does not see that I think the discretion the EPA may have to find an order isn't required in every case. Has made it pretty clear that orders will be required each time they make a B finding. I think that sort of the value of that may be questionable if the concern is a use that the PMN submitter does not intend to practice. An order that combines only the PMN submitter as opposed to a SNR, it doesn't really do anything, doesn't really reduce risk. but I think that's the interpretation of the statute that we've seen. The other statement that she's made is that EPA is not going to rely on SDS or implications of other law to control exposure assumptions. The concern was that these the traditional practice of looking at what the PMN submitters described as the PMN as the way it will be used, is no guarantee that it will be used that way. It's not sort of binding the same way a permit or something else would be. So that may also affect the number of B findings that are made, more opportunities for where they'll be sort of deemed to be sort of uncontrolled exposures. It's also indicated that where there isn't enough information to make a risk determination, rather than just controlling the exposures, they may be more aggressive in seeking to cause companies to develop data as part of the new chemical review process. And so the total effect of these things is going to be that in most cases, I think we're going to expect not only SNRs for new chemicals, but also orders, and it becomes much more like a permit-like system where you are sort of authorized. You're authorized for particular uses with very structured controls that go with those uses. The other is just in terms of processing time. Again, there's no way that they can essentially do all the paperwork to issue the orders and all the SNRs without devoting a lot of man hours, people hours, staff resources to putting those in place. So I think we can expect a return to the long delays and deep backlogs in getting new chemical applications reviewed. Next slide. Compounding this or sort of adding to this, EPA also is looking to issue a new procedural rule. This is actually an effort that was started under the Trump administration. And one part of this is just to update the current PMN and SNR rules to reflect the changes that were required by the statute. The agency's gone beyond that, and I think is also looking to, based on the characterization, the unified agenda, to address, I think, some additional issues. They want to, again, update it to reflect what the statute requires, but also finding some updates that may improve EPA's review efficiency for PMNs, increase the quality of information that PMNs will include when they're submitted, and terms that are going to reduce the number of reworks that they get. This is a redo of a risk assessments, typically due to getting sort of new information in the course of the PMN process. So that all sounds good. I think the risk is going to be here is that now that we'll see these new rules codify the new approach that has been announced for using SNRs or not using SNRs, so more B findings be sort of codified into the procedures. And I think we can expect to see an expansion of the information that are going to be required to be put into PMNs. So probably not changing the categories, but being more particular about the kind of information that that should be included as companies were preparing those. And then to reduce reworks, having better information up front would certainly help. But I think it's also possible the agency might propose terms that would create disincentives for providing late information that would cause EPA to have to rework risk assessments due to after acquired information, and that those may be sort of reset penalties on time clocks or other means. But I think to try to create disincentives for receiving late information. So we'll have to wait and see. But I think there's a real concern that these new review policies will bring us back to where we were at the latter half of 2016, with again, long review times and deep backlogs for PMN reviews. So next slide.
Thank you, James. Thank you, James. So yes, I mean, absolutely. Obviously, the Biden administration tends to codify their procedures. Now, you may recall that Trump also, the Trump administration, they had floated a draft plan for how they would implement the new chemicals program under Lautenberg. If you may recall, the environmentalists sued in the DC circuits, even though it was just a draft guidance document, and they knew that the court would throw it out. But it did accomplish by getting something. It got the Trump administration to back down to a certain degree what they were planning. So, you know, during the Trump administration, the environmentalists sued at each turn to try to force the administration to move forward in their direction. The key question is, what are we going to do? What are people going to do to try to force the Biden administration to turn in a more industry-friendly direction? So that was new chemicals. I want to talk about risk evaluation. Next slide, please. I can't stretch back to the Clinton EPA as James did, because there was no risk evaluation of existing chemicals pre-Lautenberg. But there was, Lautenberg actually was amended in 2016. And just one day before the inauguration of President Trump, EPA issued a proposed risk evaluation rule, which you may not remember. But what that rule said basically is that EPA would do their risk evaluations looking at all conditions of use. So all manufacture, all processing, all distribution, commerce, use, and disposal activities that constitute the conditions of use within the meaning of TSCA. So the risk evaluation would cover all conditions of use without any exception. And a risk evaluation would encompass all known, intended, reasonably foreseeable activities associated with the chemical. Now, the Obama EPA proposal did say that not all uses would get the same level of attention in the risk evaluation. Some could be done less quantitatively than others. So, for example, lower volume or less dispersive uses might receive less quantitative, data-driven evaluations than other uses. But there was no question, absolutely crystal clear in the Obama proposed regulation that they would interpret conditions of use to require that all conditions of use be evaluated in the risk evaluation process. Next slide, please. Now, Trump era came out 18 months later with a final rule. Interestingly, that final rule was never reproposed. It just went final, which was a 180-degree turn. And basically what was decided is that risk determinations would be made on a use-by-use basis. And that's actually how the Trump EPA proceeded with all of the first 10 substances that were subject to risk evaluation on the TSCA. Now, the Trump EPA pinned this interpretation on the legislative history, which I think a lot of people believe was very clear, that gave EPA the discretion to determine the conditions of use that it considered to be the most important, so that the agency could focus its resources on those uses that had the greatest potential risk. And so as a result of that legislative history, and the language, by the way, doesn't really address it. I mean, there's a lot of discussion, and there was a lot of discussion both in the Obama proposed rule, which was basically underpinned on the basis of language in terms of the use of the word "the conditions of use" as opposed to all conditions of use. So it's basically turned on some linguistic tricks. But the reality is, I think the legislative history of the statute is very clear. The Congress intended EPA to have flexibility to look at what they consider to be the most important uses. By the way, Judge Chen in the District Court, California, in the initial decision on the fluorination case, went through that legislative history in great detail, and he also came to that same conclusion. But in any event, that is what the Trump administration decided. They said they would exercise their discretion. And what did that discretion mean? Well, it meant that they could not examine uses when they did a risk evaluation, where other agencies, for example, OSHA, the Clean Air Act Office, or other offices within EPA had held jurisdiction. Uses and constituted misuse of a chemical, illegal uses of a chemical, speculative future uses of a chemical, uses that were inconsistent with labeling or PPE requirements, chemicals they use in articles, uses inconsistent with manufacturing instructions, et cetera, et cetera. So they carved out of the risk evaluations that they did during the Trump era a variety of uses that could potentially have be associated with the chemical, and they focused only on what they considered to be the most important uses, and that interpretation was vigorously attacked by the environmental groups. Next slide, please. So there was a lawsuit brought by environmental groups in 2019 in the Ninth Circuit, and at the heart of that case was really what conditions of use meant. But if you actually look at that decision very carefully, the Ninth Circuit actually declined to rule on that aspect of the case because EPA had argued that it wasn't clear yet what the agency intended to do, whether they would look at various uses, look at all uses. It was what we call not ripe for review by a court. And so the court accepted that and said they wouldn't rule on that decision. But they ruled on other things. Now, the problem, at least from my perspective, in terms of not getting the court to rule on that, of course, the court could have ruled against the Trump administration, but then we would be no worse than we are now with the Biden administration. But it's also possible that just as Judge Chen in the District Court of California considered the legislative history to be compelling in the absence of language that clearly defined the question, it's also possible the Ninth Circuit would have agreed with Trump's administration. And that would have codified by a court decision the interpretation of conditions of use. So what we have now is we have a situation, we had one administration interpreted one way, you have another administration interpreted a second way, and it becomes a political decision as to how this term is interpreted. And that's not really the way the law should be interpreted. The law should be interpreted based on what was Congress's intent at the time that they enacted it. It shouldn't be based on which particular administration is at spearheading EPA at a particular point in time. So anyway, what the court did in the Ninth Circuit case is they did overturn the agency's policy of generally excluding legacy uses from the TSCA evaluation, in particular the legacy uses of asbestos. That's something which I think, which the Trump Department of Justice conceded at oral argument, which I thought was a mistake, but they conceded for some reason. And so the court, basically grabbed onto that and said that EPA had to evaluate the legacy uses of asbestos. And as a result of the Ninth Circuit not having addressed this, the NGOs have raised this issue in the context of litigation on a number of the risk evaluations for the first 10. Now, the way this works is if you have a risk evaluation and you have a no unreasonable risk determination, you can challenge that in court. And that's what the environmentalists have done. They've challenged those findings of the different risk evaluations where EPA concluded that certain uses did not pose an unreasonable risk. So they've challenged those in courts. And even though, and I'll explain in a second, even though the Biden administration says that they will now consider conditions of use as a whole, which the environmentalists should consider a victory, the environmentalists are opposed to the court not ruling on this question because the environmentalists understand that once the court actually decides the question, then that interpretation cannot be overturned simply because there's a change in the administration. So even though the Biden administration is giving the NGOs everything they want, the NGOs are still want to litigate this because they want the courts to rule definitively that their interpretation of what conditions of use is correct, and therefore, if the administration changes in the future, you cannot go back from what the court said. Now, next slide, please. So let's talk, for example, the HBCD and methylene chloride cases. So EPA has these are cases brought by environmentalist groups challenging no unreasonable risk findings for certain of the uses. And EPA has asked the court to allow voluntarily, or EPA has asked for a voluntary remand of the case by leaving the decisions in place. And what EPA wants the remand to is to revisit, whether the conditions of use should be done on a case-by-case basis or as a determination of the chemical as a whole, whether assumptions that workers use appropriate PPE are valid assumptions, and whether the risk evaluations take into consideration additional analyses involving tribal or environmental justice communities. And there'll also be EPA also intends to seek public comments, and there's similar request for voluntary remand without vacatur in the methylene chloride case. It covers all these additional issues, but also EPA wants to reconsider whether it was appropriate to exclude air emissions simply because those are under the jurisdiction of EPA's air office. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, even though EPA wants the cases remanded to them so they can actually make a determination that fully supports what the environmentalist groups want, the environmentalist groups are opposed to this request for remand because they want the courts to decide the question so that when there's another administration, if there ever is another Republican administration, that they won't be able to have any room to depart from what the court has decided. So what does this whole mean about conditions of use? Why is this important to people? Well, if you sort of think about it, if you do a risk evaluation on the chemical as a whole, then there'll be no uses that have a no unreasonable risk determination, because if you're selecting a chemical as a high priority for risk evaluation, then there must be at least one use, which is a problem. And so therefore every chemical that undergoes a risk evaluation will be branded as posing an unreasonable risk. I think more importantly, the statute gives discretion. It doesn't require, but it gives discretion for EPA to aggregate the risks. And so, which basically means you take all the risks associated with each conditions of use, all the conditions of use, you combine them all, and you may actually end up concluding that the risk associated with the chemical is unreasonable, even though there's no individual risk by itself, which would cause one to consider the risk to be unreasonable. So we have the same problem in pesticides, where there's a risk cup, and people are concerned that minor uses may fill up the risk cup, and that's why a lot of pesticide companies sort of don't support certain minor uses. We may have the same problem with chemicals, where certain minor uses may fill up the risk cup, or it may well be the legacy uses, which are already out there, maybe it's sufficient, pose sufficiently high risk that you cannot conclude that any additional use of these chemicals would be safe. And so that's, I think, the great concern. That's why the environmentalists have been pushing this hard for years. And it looks like, at least during this administration, the chickens have come home to roost. So other consequences of the conditions of use determination is that if you think about it, you get preemption if EPA makes a no unreasonable risk determination. Since I indicated they're not likely to make any of those, there won't be any preemption after the risk evaluation issues. I already mentioned the problem with aggregate exposure. I already mentioned the problem with legacy uses. If you also think about it, currently the manufacturing requested risk evaluations are based on the evaluation, on the use that the manufacturer is interested in supporting, but that won't prevail, because they'll have to actually consider and provide information on all uses of the chemical. Next slide, please. So one big question, I think, is, does EPA have to repropose their risk evaluation rule? And I believe they absolutely do, but I don't think that's being contemplated by the Biden administration. And I'll tell you why they do. If you look at the language in the final rule, which issued during the Trump administration, there's no question that with respect to an unreasonable risk determination, it clearly says that EPA will consider each condition of use within the scope of risk evaluation, either in a single decision document or multiple decision documents. There's no way to interpret that other than EPA will look at a use-by-use basis. That has to be changed by rulemaking. And secondly, if you look at the manufacturing request for risk evaluations, there's no question that they have under the Trump administration, on the final rule, they could request an evaluation on only uses of interest to them. But if the Biden EPA wants to look at the chemical as a whole, they'll have to change that regulation as well. Next slide, please. I'll leave this for you. I mean, there are a bunch of things that are, kind of disturbing that are coming out. And it's reminiscent of what goes on in Europe. I think a lot of people know I do a lot of REACH work. And I always remark when I do a REACH 3030 that every time I get up in the morning, I see that ECHA has been doing something, and that's disturbing. And it's now turning out to be the same, that every time I get up in the morning and look at the trade press and I see what the Biden administration is up to, I say, well, they're also doing something that's disturbing. Next slide, please. Those are my final thoughts. Next slide. Running out of time. So can we have our next REACH 3030? As we know, we're doing those every other month. And so the next one's in July 14th, which, if you don't know, is Bastille Day. So we expect a very good turnout, except in France. And next TSCA 3030, which, even though I think James did a great job, we're hoping to have David Fisher again, it'll be July 14th as well. There's always an OSHA 3030 on June 16th. Next slide, please. And that's it. Take care, everybody. I'm Herbert Stryker, and we're joined today by James Vota, and I hope you enjoyed our short presentation entitled Chickens Come Home to Roost, the Biden administration's implementation of TSCA. Take care, everybody.